Can I then invite John Cooper to sum up for the defence, please?
Thank you. Members of the jury, let me immediately submit to you this. It's a submission which explains to you what you have to decide in this case and what you don't have to decide. You don't have to decide whether the defendant, Dr Crippen, murdered someone. What you do have to decide is, are you satisfied so that you are sure, satisfied beyond all reasonable doubt on the evidence that you've heard, and I'm going to summarise in a moment, that he murdered Belle Elmore. That is the sole issue that you as a jury have to consider and decide upon. Have the prosecution satisfied you so that you are sure that Hawley Harvey Crippen murdered Belle Elmore? It is not for the defence, and we're not going to speculate about the body in the cellar. It no doubt would be an interesting discussion and an interesting debate which we can have at a time and a place elsewhere. But that is not the purpose of this retrial. And I'm not going to detain you, members of the jury, with speculation, discussion, or debate about that body in the cellar. This is not a novel submission I'm making to you now, in 2012. It indeed was a very pressing submission during the course of this defendant's trial in October of 1910. The trial judge in the case then hit the nail on the head, and it is pertinent then as it is now. The Lord Chief Justice Alvas this to the jury, and I cite him word for word. Gentlemen, I think I may pass for the purpose of your consideration from the question of whether it was a man or a woman. He goes on. If of course, if it was a man, again the defendant is entitled to walk out of that dock. And that is very much the area that my submission will address. The only slight nuance on it is, it's not if it was a man. If you are not satisfied so that you are sure that it was Belle Elmore, then in accordance with the law as it was 102 years ago, as it is now, and I stray for a moment upon his lordship's parameter, the defendant is entitled to his acquittal. The proceedings here are not a search or a detective novel to find out what happened at Hilldrop Crescent, however attractive that may be to us, however interesting all the books are that we've read and that have been referred to you a little earlier on by the expert witness at the start of this trial. Fascinating. And no doubt more books will be written. But that's not the purpose here for you members of the jury, to speculate, pontificate, or use your imaginations. The Crown bring this case, and it is for the Crown to prove their case. This defendant need prove nothing. You heard some of his cross-examination. He needn't have gone into the witness box, he needn't have given evidence. But he chose to. But again, if the Crown have not satisfied you so that you are sure of this defendant's guilt, then he is entitled today, as you would be entitled if it was your trial, or your family or your friends were being tried. You would be entitled to that finding of not guilty if the Crown have not established their case. a little bit of background first to see whether the Crown's eloquent submissions to you a moment ago actually are the only version in town, if I can put it that way. Because it's suggested, certainly by the defence, that, of course, the marriage between Belle Elmore and the defendant was not a marriage made in heaven. In fact, to use a 21st century parlance, it was clearly dysfunctional. And indeed, it is the defence's case that Belle Elmore ran away with another man and effectively, potentially, although it's not necessarily for the defence case to prove it, left the country. Was Belle Elmore the type of person who might have done that? Well, you only have to consider the evidence that you've heard a moment ago. There is no doubt whatsoever, and it is accepted by the prosecution, that she was a woman, and a matter for her. This is not a court of morals. I'm not judging her. These are simply the facts. She was a woman who had affairs. Indeed, the defendant can hardly put himself on the pedestal. But I emphasise again, this is not a court of morals. This is a court of judging clinically evidence. She was a woman who the Crown accept had affairs. Indeed, she had a number of affairs, and I'm not going to detain you with all of them, but one, for instance, a man who you've already heard from in evidence earlier on this evening, Bruce Miller. He was a performer. In fact, he was what's known as a one-man band. Remember those? He also happened to be married with 4 children, who lived in the United States. And whilst Bruce Miller, an American, was over in this country, he was having an affair with Belle Elmore. And what sort of affairs did Belle Elmore have? Again, this is not to judge her, but it is simply to establish the facts of the case, without emotion. Well, we have a letter, and it's been presented to you, from Bruce Miller to Belle Elmore, which finishes with love and kisses, brown eyes. It is perhaps just one example that affairs were being had, and sometimes they were passionate. Neighbours would, and have given evidence in this case, that Belle would often have affairs and go to bed with men in Hilldrop Crescent, sometimes when the defendant was there. Let me submit immediately, this on the evidence had been going on for some years. If the defendant was prone to a fit of pique or a fit of anger, why did he put up with this for so long? And we'll deal with the straw breaking the camel's back argument a bit later. But we submit it doesn't make sense. Belle would travel on occasions to America. She'd travel to Manhattan. And there again, there's evidence that she would have a matter for her, and not for us to judge, but the fact is, affairs. There's evidence that Belle was dissatisfied with the earnings that Dr Crippen was bringing in. So here was a marriage that was not going well on both sides. Here was a marriage that both sides cannot cover themselves with glory about, and in no way am I defending the behaviour of my client in relation to Ethel and Eve. Of course, this is not a court of morals. But it is clear that when it is suggested by the defence that the wife of Dr Crippen decided to leave him and decided to start a new life, it is potentially, although the defence have to prove nothing, I emphasise, it is potentially consistent with past events and past behaviour. A little later in my brief submissions to you, I shall be dealing with the higher scene and why that might have been necessary for legitimate purposes. But consider the evidence of Seymour Hicks, a theatre producer who was a friend of Belle Elmore's, who would at occasions come into Hilldrop Crescent and, quote, see her in the middle of the day, newly risen from her bed, with a hangover. Hyoscine is a well-known antidote to alcoholism. Again, when it comes for you to consider the grave and sinister connotations being placed by the prosecution on Hyoscine, of which I will return to later, consider that this particular component has more than one use, has a use for dealing with people that have alcohol addiction and alcohol problems, which Bell Elmore clearly had on the evidence, and is a tool to assist for that. Consider all that evidence. But what the jury did not have in 1910 was forensic evidence concerning the body, if I may call it, in the cellar. Remember this, that body had been dismembered. All the sex organs had been removed, and it was buried under the floor in a coal cellar and discovered on the 13th of July 1910. Remember, when it comes to the prosecution proving their case, so that you be satisfied, so that you are sure that there were no witnesses, of course, to this alleged murder or alleged killing, and that the body had been mutilated to such an extent that its gender and indeed identification could not have been achieved. The night before, the Crown had referred to a party with the Martinettis, close family friends. Dinner seemed to have gone relatively well. I'm not certainly submitting that suddenly the Crippens were all lovey-dovey with each other, but it had gone relatively well, despite a little bit of an argument over whether Dr Crippen should show someone where the lavatory was. But it had gone pretty well, nothing major. And that the Martinettis remember leaving the Crippens on the doorstep, waving contentedly to them at about 1:30 in the morning. That, of course, was the last time that Bell Elmore was seen. But for the Crown to add "seen alive" rather adds a colour to the evidence, which you may feel, on the evidence that you've heard so far, is unfair. But what the jury did not have in 1910 was categoric evidence about what that body in the cellar represented. And remember, members of the jury, what I said at the start of my submissions to you. Lord Alveston, the trial judge, said if there's any doubt, I paraphrase him, if there's any doubt that the body in the cellar was Bell Elmore, he said a female, but Bell Elmore is it, then the defendant must walk free from the dock. For those of you that might be of a cynical mind that this is simply an issue which is being brought up now by the defence, when Dr Crippen appealed, and his appeal was rejected on the 5th of November 1910, one of the grounds of appeal was, and I quote, that there was no proper evidence to establish the fact that the remains of the body were those of a woman. So the point was being taken on the 5th of November 1910, that there was no proper evidence to establish the fact that the remains of the body were that of a woman. But of course what the lawyers and the court were not assisted by back in 1910 were the advances of science that we have today. And I'm going to be submitting to you that the evidence is overwhelming that the DNA discovered of flesh associated with that body in the cellar is the DNA of a man, and that further there's gender examination, a high-level gender examination on the flesh, which I'll deal with you in a moment, which goes further, a second doctor, which in fact says, again, that the flesh is male. You will remember the evidence, members of the jury, of John H. Retrial. And I have his affidavit with me now. He is the American scientist who in 2008 examined the flesh sample, found on one of the original slides used in the trial, used to prove, so the Crown said, that the remains found were Bell Elmore's, known in the case as the Spilsbury slide. And I'll come on to Spilsbury, Dr. Spilsbury, a little later. There's no challenge by the prosecution, you'll notice in their closing address to you, to this examination. In fact, tellingly, the Crown haven't even touched upon it in their closing address to you. Why is that? Because they have no answer to it. If the Crown had an answer to undermine this forensic examination, you would have heard from them. They simply address you on the 1910 situation. And as we all know, in miscarriage of justice jurisprudence, things move on. And the reason the Crown haven't attempted to undermine this 2008 evidence is because simply they cannot. And if they cannot, members of the jury, how on earth can this prosecution satisfy you so that you are sure that the remains in the cellar were male or female? You don't have to even decide the issue. Doubt is enough. Let me read to you the affidavit of John Trestrow, a scientist from Michigan in the United States, a toxicologist also by profession, a fellow of the American Academy of Clinical Toxicology and Forensic Science, who has worked in the areas of clinical and forensic toxicology. He goes on, from 1992 to 1999, a visiting instructor for the FBI's National Academy in Virginia, teaching classes for law enforcement attendees, teaching classes on the investigation of murder forensically. His main area of research being precisely that, the forensic investigation of murder. He was given a core sample of DNA from Belle Elmore's grandnieces and great-grandnieces who live today. He was given the Spilsbury slide that had been stored in a London hospital since it was used at the trial. He employed modern DNA techniques which weren't even in existence because DNA hadn't even been discovered at the time of the now discredited, we submit, Dr. Spilsbury. Had the DNA, we say in passing, been available to be tested in 1910, there is no doubt whatsoever that the court in 1910 would have heard of these results. And what they would have heard was this, that following examination, my conclusion is, says Trestrow, that the tissue belongs to a male individual. Not might belong, belongs to a male individual. And he goes on to say the analysis was conducted by a number of forensic biologists in the same forensic laboratory. And he signs his affidavit as an affidavit of truth. He says, these results indicate that genealogy aside, there is no way that the remains are those of Cora Crippen, and that there is no evidence that Hawley Harvey Crippen killed his wife. Members of you, that goes so much to the centre and heart of this case that I'll repeat it again. These results indicate, genealogy aside, that there is no way that the remains are those of the missing Cora Crippen, and that there is thus no evidence that Hawley Harvey Crippen killed his wife. If the court in 1910 had have had that, how do you think his lordship, Lord Chief Justice Alveston, would have answered his own question when he said, of course, if it was a man, again the defendant is entitled to walk free from that dock. This is not a case, and there is never a criminal case where you have to decide, is a person criminally minded? Did he kill anyone? Is he guilty of killing people? Is he guilty of committing murder? This is a case, members of the jury, that you have to decide whether the Crown has satisfied you so that you are sure that this man killed his wife. Dr. Foran, another scientist, considered the Spilsbury slide. He did gender tests, detailed gender tests on the sample, including other toxicology tests. He was of the definite view that the Spilsbury slide used in the trial of Crippen, indicating to the jury in the Crown's case that it was from the body of Belle Elmore. Dr. Foran's conclusion, the slide, the flesh is male, is male. Yes, the flesh was presented to the jury, and it was suggested that there was an operation scar on it. But what the Crown didn't submit to is that there was a great dispute about whether, in fact, it was an operation scar. At the time, the jury believed the evidence of Bernard Spilsbury. He was at the start of a very illustrious career. If they, we submit, had known about what we know about him now, then, they might not have been so keen or quick to accept the rather robust views of Bernard Spilsbury, who over years, his techniques and attitude to presentation of evidence became much criticised as being biased, bombastic and inflexible. And indeed, at the end of his career, he was, to some extent, discredited. But of course, this was very early on in his career. Spilsbury's examination techniques were again somewhat unorthodox. He didn't particularly like to wear gloves or any other covering when he performed his pathology. But he was a bombastic man, as it later came out, and not prone to be contradicted. But he became also a bit of a matinee idol, that the attitude of the courts was, because of his attitude then, that he was not to be tampered with, he was not to be contradicted. And his word, as he believed, was the law. If we rely purely upon his evidence, members of the jury, we submit it is unreliable, so much so that you cannot be satisfied so that you're sure of this man's guilt. The Operation Scar evidence was disputed. The evidence of Spilsbury was accepted at the time. We ask again, rhetorically, had the jury then known about Spilsbury, his unorthodox and at times negligent techniques, would they have been so willing to rely on his evidence then, as they did then, now? Other evidence in the case, again, the jury in 1910 might have been interested in hearing about. I'd like some water if possible. Interested in hearing about. Inspector Dew. Here was a man who enjoyed his job. And again, as time went on, it became clear that Inspector Dew had been a little bit economical, thank you, with his own approach. Pardon? I will, of course, so much evidence. Inspector Dew, for instance, was giving press conferences, was giving press conferences immediately after the arrest, verbling, effectively, as we call it in the law, saying things that Crippen had said that clearly later he hadn't said. As the Crown quite adequately put it, it was reported that he held out his hands in handcuffs. Very correctly put. Who was it reported by? Inspector Dew immediately ran off the gangplank and started giving press conferences. Inspector Dew, you may feel a man who desperately wanted his conviction. I hurry on. Practicalities. Belle Elmore, to be as careful as I can, was a big lady. Crippen was a very slight man. How did he get her down to the cellar? It's physically, we submit, impossible. Even so, that she was a dead weight, apparently, dragged down the stairs. There were no signs of dismemberment in the house. There was no forensic evidence of blood anywhere. A very, very peculiar situation. And yet, about 1/3 of her blood content was gone. So the Crown said when they were saying that the body was hers. How did that happen if the murder took place in the house? A question you don't have to resolve every single question. But of course it does beg the question, how did such a slight man get such a large woman as a dead weight down to that cellar? No evidence of dismemberment, no evidence of draining of the blood whatsoever. Hyoscine. Yes, hyoscine features a lot in this case. But hyoscine also has a use to calm violent alcoholics. It was used in institutions at the time to do so. It is also known in other spheres, an aphrodisiac, a device, a substance to control sexual odour. Now, I'm not going to get into what on earth the Crippens were up to, or indeed Ethel and Eve was up to. Crippen was a quack doctor. He often had hyoscine. This wasn't unusual. And I'll just posit this question with you as I'm hurrying on now, I'm aware of time. If Crippen was a murderer and was getting his tool for murder, hyoscine, you would have expected him to cover his tracks. And yet, the Lewis and Burroughs, where he bought it from, have a document, which you've seen, where he actually signs the register saying, thank you very much for the hyoscine. Now, members of the jury, if a man, woman or other is getting a weapon, and in this case hyoscine, to kill someone, only days later on the Crown's hypothesis, you may think you might get it a little more surreptitiously than going to Lewis and Burroughs and saying, signing a document, Dr Crippen, thanks very much for the hyoscine. I paraphrase, but signing off for the hyoscine. Submissions, he's lied. Yes, he did lie. His lordship may direct you on this, but people lie for different reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're guilty. We call it in the Laura Lucas direction. People lie sometimes to protect themselves. People lie out of panic. People lie to protect other people. Crippen had good cause to lie to protect Ethel the Neve. He was vigilantly protective of Ethel the Neve, and indeed instructed Marshal Hall at the time that he was not to raise the manslaughter defence because it would implicate Ethel the Neve. I invite you, although my primary submissions to you are that this man is not guilty, the Crown have not proved their case. But even, and I have to deal with all issues, if you are against me on that, which I submit, it's nowhere near that, manslaughter is an option for you. Did he give her the hyoscine when she was being violent in one of her alcoholic rages? Was it a way to subdue her whilst he made love to Ethel the Neve? It certainly is an option we submit for this court to consider not guilty murder but guilty manslaughter. It's an option, but it's very much a secondary option. Our primary submission to you is not guilty. Crippen accepts he lied, but you can lie for many different reasons. It doesn't mean guilt. Neither does running away mean guilt. It can mean panic. It can mean wanting to just to get away from the focus of attention, however ill-advised, with the woman you love. Finally, we know little about Crippen, don't we? Save the waxwork figure or the image the Crown paint of him. John Nash, cited by the prosecution as a friend of Bill Elmore. How very strange it is then that I conclude my submissions to you by using him as a character witness. Because John Nash, the friend, as the prosecution had put it to you, of Bill Elmore, described to you in this very court, quote, the kindly nature, end quote, of Dr Crippen. Of Dr Crippen. And that's the witness the Crown rely on. And if the Crown's witness is saying that against the defendant, how can you possibly be satisfied so that you are sure, so much so, that in 1910 you sent him to the gallows, and in 2012 you sentence him to whatever my Lord feels appropriate, by your verdict. Thank you.